Hello, this is alexkaapa. I feel urged to make a response to Veritas48's video against the argument from Nonbelief, a response to theoretical bullshit, which in turn, as the title already points out, is a response to theoretical bullshit. Veritas has made a good job to split the video into easily coherent passages, so I'll just respond chronologically to his points, which I find relevant. Here we go.
Now, to assess this, we need to define some terms, and luckily Scott does that. He defines the Christian God to be a conscious personal being which A, created the universe and everything in it, B, is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, C, wants each and every soul to be saved and know the truth, D, has provided a means for each soul to be saved, and E, has not made it clear or apparent to the world that any of the above is even true. Now, before I jump into the argument, this last claim, E, that God has not made it clear or apparent to the world, is only assumed because there are people in the world who don't buy what Christianity is offering. But that doesn't mean that God has not made it evident that he exists. It just means that people are still unconvinced.
I think Veritas has made a mistake in being inconsistent with the implications of the first four premises A to D. The reason why one can safely say that God hasn't made it evident that he exists is that he knows how much evidence is needed to convince anyone, and he knows that the people are only convinced with that specific amount of evidence. Thus, if someone isn't convinced, God hasn't made his existence evident.
And as we'll see, the major assumption in this argument is that there's no room for anything other than God not making A through D clear. It's as if all of this takes place in a sort of vacuum and there's no alternatives. It's as if Scott would have us believe that everyone would stop and suddenly have a relationship with the Lord if he were to make A through D patently clear to everybody. And it's not even an option to Scott that some people could reject any knowledge God provides for them that should have eventually led to belief in A through D.
I wanted to rest this last point, since it again ignores a feature of God made in premises A to D, namely that God is all-loving. For in this case, God will not create people who could not freely believe, leaving as the only option to convince him, forcing him to believe. This would not be permitted, since free will is one thing that God wouldn't violate.
So for now, Scott's argument from non-belief goes like this. God desires for us to know X, where X is God's existence, the fact that we're sinners, and God's redemptive plan of salvation. And so the argument is as follows. Premise 1, if God exists, he desires for us to know X. Premise 2, if God exists, he has the power to make us know X. Premise 3, if God exists, from 1 and 2, we should know X. Premise 4, we don't know X. Therefore, God does not exist. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these premises first before I offer a real response to this here, a good refutation. Premise 1 of Scott's argument has real problems. You'll remember that premise 1 states that if God exists, he desires for us to know X. So perhaps God could make his existence overtly and unequivocally obvious, as Scott seems to require at the 7:55 mark of his video. But this assumes propositional knowledge to be God's primary concern. However, it's filial knowledge that is of a higher importance in Christian theology, and providing the entire world with full propositional knowledge of God's existence may in fact be deleterious to filial knowledge. It may be deleterious to a relationship with God.
Again, he is forgetting an attribute of God, this time the fact that God is all-loving. If he proved his existence to someone, that person would also know that he is all-loving, since God, being all-loving, wouldn't create natural evil beings who would want to be sinful instead. We would all want to have a personal relationship with God. You might argue that not only evil people would do evil acts in today's world due to the temptation of sin, but this kind of world shouldn't exist in the first place, because no one should want to be sinful, since that implies someone having an intention which is sinful or evil, and an evil intention must come from the nature of the person having that intention.
It may lead to more propositional knowledge, right? A lot of it, maybe even full propositional knowledge. But this way in no way guarantees filial knowledge.
According to my last argument, exactly that would be guaranteed, because us knowing God exists would mean that we would know of his benevolence, which we, due to that benevolence, naturally would turn to. To refute this argument, you must simply explain why God should want to create people with the intention to commit sin, since that is the only way for anything like sin to enter the world.
Now, premise 2 of the argument is also problematic. You'll remember that premise 2 says that if God exists, he has the power to make us know X. Again, where X is 1, God's existence, 2, the fact that we're sinners, and 3, God's redemptive plan of salvation. Now, my primary problem with premise 2 is that it leads to a contradiction. Scott is saying that God has the power to make us know we're sinners. That's part of X, to know that we're sinners. But knowing one is a sinner is in all actuality a choice that we freely make.
I think premise 2 is wrong as well, but that is because we wouldn't have to become sinners if God had made his existence clear to us in the first place. This follows from my last argument. We would then freely admit anything, because there would be nothing bad we should have to admit.
Now, I want you to notice with this argument that all I would have to do, all any theist would have to do, to defeat Scott's argument, is find a single possible explanation as to why God would allow for non-belief and remain hidden, even when the potential threat of hell and our eternal security are at stake, right? Even when those are the topic at hand. Now, remember here that Scott's argument is a logical argument, and it requires that God has no possible reason for allowing non-belief of X. Once a possible reason has been elucidated, this argument is defeated, okay? And it could very well be the case that if God made his existence completely apparent to everybody, this would in effect take away our freedom to make morally significant decisions. And this argument has been presented by Michael Murray at Franklin and Marshall College. There's a link to the PDF of this paper in the description of this video. Dr. Murray argues that if God revealed himself in a way that Scott demands, for example, it takes away our freedom to make morally significant decisions, none the least of which includes responding to what self-revelation he's given. So in other words, Dr. Murray argues that God purposefully remains partially hidden in order to give people the necessary space to either respond to him or avoid him and keep their autonomy from him.
Yeah, it's true that a theist would only have to give a plausible argument why God should have to want to be hidden. But this argument fails because it implies that we would want to stay away from him. That would mean that we would want to avoid goodness, which only is given if we have an evil intention. Knowing God would give us as much space as we would need, because our choice to follow him would come directly from our nature, making it free, and our decisions are as morally significant as can be.
If what Scott means by that are people who have actually heard the gospel and just sweep it under the rug as another form of folly, then that's different. Because a good case can be made that Christianity is not folly. Scott assumes that there's no way to assess the validity of a worldview or a religion. He makes the assumption that they're all equally crazy, and that a person is not endowed with the ability to assess the truthfulness of specific religious claims. In fact, he says that it's actually a matter of guessing the right set of propositions to believe in. He says that there's a whole lot of religions out there that make a whole lot of claims.
Of course he makes that claim. Since he has not been convinced by religious arguments, the reason for the failure of all of them being that they, to him, contain some logical inconsistency. If that is his experience with every religion, then he is right to say that choosing the right religion is a matter of guessing, because the reasoning behind has always shown to have been flawed.
Further, and I can't stress this enough, this argument is incredibly presumptuous, this argument from non-belief. It's just another way of saying, if the Christian God were real, he would do such and such. But this assumes knowledge of what God would do, and I fail to see how Scott is in the proper position to have such knowledge.
It is irrelevant whether our knowledge of how God would act is flawed, because we have come to that conclusion through our best possible deduction. Therefore, this would only mean that our reasoning capacities are flawed, and only that can be corrected. This is the best we could do, and these boundaries of understanding are what God chose to give us then. Thus, since a wrong conclusion about God would come through the best possible application of our reasoning capacities, God would want us to interpret him this way. If you cannot make a case why God should want us to have a wrong understanding of him, I am safe to conclude that this should not be the case if God were all loving. Thus, we can trust our deduction and our reasoning capacities, since this must portray the right kind of God if he existed. Only if he didn't exist could one doubt our deduction, because then we must keep in mind our possibly flawed reasoning capacities. I hope I have made a decent case defending the argument from unbelief. Thanks for watching. Responses are welcome, and I think that's it.